So let's start then. I would like to introduce to you Pol Salem, who kindly agreed to present his speech here at our regular seminar named after Г.И.Мирский. I'm also very happy to greet those who decided to join us this time. I would say there is a great choice now of meetings, seminars, webinars, things like that. And thank you for preferring to stay with us today. So Pol Salem is president of Middle East Institute based in Washington, D.C. He is a co-editor of several books and he is writing extensively. And I'm sure that probably you know some of his publications. He is a well-known specialist on the Middle East, and it is our pleasure and honor to have him this time. And he promised to give us a speech on United States interests and policy in the Middle East in the shadow of the presidential elections. So I would say this is the most thrilling topic, which is widely discussed. There are a lot of debates, a lot of speculations, whether Trump will stay or if not, what will be after him. So we are very much looking forward to Pol Salem, who will probably make it a little bit more clear to us. So Paul, the floor is yours. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Irina, so much. It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to see Nikolai. We've been regularly meeting often in Berlin and in other places. It's been a while since I've been to Moscow. But it's great that we can meet through this technological medium. And it's certainly a pleasure and an honor to be a guest of the Mirsky seminar at the Center for Middle East Studies. My comments will be about U.S. interests, about current U.S. policy, and about the potential impact both of the pandemic and its effect, and of the elections and their effect. So let me start with interests. I would list 7 U.S. interests in the Middle East. First, and the oldest one, is energy. And I would attach to that energy as well as trade and commerce and this global centrality of the U.S. dollar. Obviously, this relationship goes back to 1945. It is based on the relationship with Saudi Arabia. Like all interests, these interests are changing and evolving. The U.S. is no longer the main consumer of Gulf energy. The U.S. is a major oil producer and exporter, so that dynamic has changed. But the interest is still there. The Gulf oil production and Gulf oil flows have a great impact on global oil prices, which greatly impacts the energy market in the US, as we saw recently with the crash of energy prices. What that means is that the US will probably not go to war again to defend oil interests in the Middle East, like maybe you can say it did when Saddam invaded Kuwait. There was no question the US went to war to protect its oil, as it were. This is no longer the case. But it's also the fact that the U.S. is not going to leave the Persian Gulf and with its navies and so on, because the option would be either to leave it to Iran and its view, or potentially to leave it to China. And that is not something the U.S. is willing to consider. Also, it is its presence in the Persian Gulf is long-term. And also within this concern over energy, as I mentioned, also trade and commerce, the importance of the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea is also very strategic for the US, because a big part of global trade flows through those portals. This means that their interest in Egypt and Israel is enduring, at least for that reason. And their naval interest in the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea is also fairly strategic. So that's the first interest. The second interest is new, 20 years old, and it's counterterrorism. But this interest has mobilized all of America's major wars in the last 19 years, which is the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, the military deployment in Syria, all motivated by counterterrorism. Also, this interest is changing. The US is concluding that it is not going to beat the terrorist groups on the battlefield. They're not going to be defeated like, I don't know, Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, and that the security of the United States is largely protected by homeland security and intelligence work. But it's still the case that the US Defense Department and intelligence is not willing yet to leave Syria or Afghanistan, and is willing to redeploy in other places where it sees a direct threat from an Al-Qaeda or ISIS or similar groups. So counterterrorism, even though both Obama and Trump are trying to bring the troops home, counterterrorism, which is mainly the Sunni jihadi groups, are still a main driver of US interest and US deployment. The third interest is long-standing. It's countering the spread of weapons of mass destruction. This partly motivated, obviously, the various negotiations and pressures with Iran. You also saw it in Libya. You saw it partly in the chemical weapons deal in Syria. So WMD remains a main concern for any administration in the US. That's a third interest. The fourth interest is 40 years old, and it is containing and countering Iran. This goes back to 1979. This conflict has not been resolved by the US or Iran. Different administrations have addressed it differently, but it remains also a major interest, a major concern of the US with regards to the Middle East. So that's a fourth interest. A fifth interest, which is returning powerfully, which obviously was present during the Cold War, but is coming back now, is great power competition. This is actually the #1 interest. If you read the National Defense Strategy of the United States, the global National Defense Strategy is designed around great power competition. The main #1 concern is China, and the #2 concern is Russia. We might get back to that in a moment. In the Middle East, great power competition is part of the dynamic and is maybe becoming increasingly important, but really has continued to take a backseat to counterterrorism, to energy issues, to Iran. So it has not really driven any major decisions in the Middle East. The Russian presence in Syria has not driven any major US decision. Chinese, infrastructure and economic presence, as well as its small presence in the Red Sea, has not driven any major US policy yet. But it's an interest that's getting more important. That's #5. #6, you might say, is a minor one, but it is a consideration. It is the concern about a further wave of refugee flows. Obviously, the first wave affected Western Europe very greatly and affected politics. And there is a fear if Egypt collapses, if Lebanon collapses, if there's trouble in North Africa and so on, that the refugee or immigration threats to Europe in particular are a concern of the United States, and they do impact policymaking, particularly in the Mediterranean. A seventh final interest, I would say, or of a political interest, is the support for Israel. Maybe it's not exactly a national security interest, but it is a political commitment that the US has had for a long time. So I would say those 7 considerations drive decision-making in the US and will continue to be the main things that decision makers, whoever is sitting in the White House, will have to think about. It is also important to note that none of these interests currently are viewed in the US as vital, as things that the US absolutely has to go on some major war to defend. This is different than the 1980s, even different than after 9/11. So they are interests. I would say they're important strategic interests, but they're not considered existential or vital interests for the US. That's important to note. So there's a bit of a downgrading. Secondly, obviously, there is a fatigue about being in the Middle East in both parties. Obama wanted to leave Afghanistan and Iraq. Trump wants to leave Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. There is an exhaustion in the military and the fatigue in the US public about that, and that's important to keep in mind, and a kind of pessimism that the US cannot fix the Middle East, sort of a bit of a give up on the Middle East attitude. Although when you look at the interests, it's clear they cannot walk away from the Middle East, but they have no longer any high hopes for the Middle East. And the third broad consideration is as a great power competition increases, particularly with China, you saw this in the Obama administration, and moving forward, the US has to be much more concerned militarily, how to deploy in the Pacific, close to China, in those areas, and to downgrade a little bit the centrality of the fights in the Middle East. So those are sort of broad timeline considerations about the US and its interests there. Now let's talk about the policies, first about policy making. It always bears repeating again and again that the policy-making process in the US is decentralized, is often very chaotic. There's multiple centers of power and multiple centers of decision-making. This has become much more acute during the Trump administration. Other administrations will make a big effort to consolidate decision-making, to centralize it, to coordinate, to make sure everybody's pursuing the same strategy. Obama did that, others did that. With President Trump, it has been very, very chaotic, to the degree that in many cases, it's hard to say what the policy is. If there is a policy, there might be different policies from different institutions of the US government. Also, if you identify a policy, that policy might reverse itself in a tweet. So it's a very chaotic, unpredictable policy situation. In normal days, the White House has its concerns and its policies and its perspectives. Of course, it's the final decision maker. But you also find that the Pentagon and the military leadership pushes its own agendas, has its interests, has its perspectives on things. The State Department also has its perspectives and its agendas, as does the intelligence community. And then you get, obviously, to the Congress, both the House and the Senate, who have their own political interests, their own control over budgets, and their own, often, foreign policy decisions. So it's a very, even in normal times, a very interesting, put it that way, process of making policy. Under the Trump administration, the president himself, you could say, is of many minds. You know, he changes his mind. He has many different opinions. They change. So it's hard to identify exactly where the president is on any one issue and how long he will stay in that position. In the White House itself, there have been several centers of power. Obviously, you've had different national security advisors pushing very, very different foreign policy agendas. You've had the family, Jared and Ivanka, pushing their own foreign policy ideas and agendas. And then you had the ideological right wing, like Steve Bannon or others that also have their own agendas. So just in the White House, you have very different opinions. I won't say any more about that other than to say it is quite a chaotic process. If we were to look at sort of where we stand now in US policy towards the Middle East, and do it, quickly without going into details, the two big issues, obviously, I think, are Iran and Israel-Palestine. On Iran, the policy is clear. It's one of maximum pressure on Iran. I would add to that it's a policy not of military escalation against Iran, trying to avoid military escalation and to allow maximum economic pressure to its effects. In the Iran policy, the US administration has had different objectives. President Trump's objective is to get Iran, is to talk to Iran, to get Iran to negotiate. And he has, I think, very limited objectives, which is one, to extend the nuclear agreement, indefinitely. In other words, to reinforce that nuclear agreement and to no longer call it Obama's agreement, but to call it Trump's agreement. That is not impossible to do with the Iranians in theory. In terms of missiles, all he has requires is that the Iranian missiles not have the range to reach the United States. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the range inside the region or ranges that might hit Europe or Russia. He considers himself an American president. He protects Americans. And on the Iran's proxy militias and terrorist affiliates, as the US calls them, Hezbollah and others, again, Trump's condition is that they not harm Americans and that they not attack American interests. So he has very limited goals, whereas people like Mike Pompeo or previously John Bolton either wanted regime change or wanted to completely permanently isolate Iran, like in North Korea. But that's where we are with Iran. Certainly no talks, no negotiations, at least until the elections. On Israel-Palestine, you've also seen a major shift in US policy to align completely with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the settlement agenda. The so-called peace plan was a giveaway plan, which is basically to give US support to Israel annexing as much as it wants of the West Bank, having permanent control of the Jordan Valley, and really precluding any possibility of a two-state solution. That is sadly where we are with this administration. We can discuss where President Biden, if he becomes president, might take it. Those were the two big ones under the Trump administration. If we look at sort of quickly going the rest of the agenda, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is extremely important to the United States. It's extremely important to this president. As I said, it relates to energy. It also relates to the centrality of the US dollar in global markets. That has been a strong relationship with this administration. The US continues to have a problem that the Gulf Cooperation Council is divided, because as you know, the US has its major base in Qatar and has very close relations with the UAE and Saudi, but all of those are fighting amongst themselves. The US has tried to fix that division, but has failed, and I would say for now has given up and just lives with that division. On Iraq, I think you've seen a kind of an evolution of that policy. Obama got out and then was forced back in. Trump's instinct was to get out, but has been convinced to stay. And I think for the foreseeable future, the US plans to stay, plans to do so in coordination with the central government in Iraq and of course with the Erbil government. And I think they see a reasonable pathway, but they're going to be reducing their military footprint in Iraq and exposure so that they're not very vulnerable to attack. They did come under attack by what they see as Iranian-backed militias in 2019, and that led to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. And the US feels that Iran got the message and is not going to threaten them, at least not President Trump, they feel, in the immediate future. So they look to be staying there. In Syria, again, Trump wanted to leave, but so far has been convinced to stay. It's not really a big issue in the US public opinion. I think that he'll be staying through the elections. We don't know exactly how things will develop in 2021, depending on elections, developments in Syria, and so on. On Yemen and Libya, the other two sort of civil war cases, the US has a very, I would say, distant policy. Another, no very strong or clear policy on Yemen, no very strong or clear policy on Libya. In Yemen, they leave it, in a sense, to Saudi Arabia and their partners there. They encourage them to find a way to de-escalate the conflict in Yemen. They keep their eye, the Americans keep their eye on Al-Qaeda in Yemen and go after them if they find them, but otherwise not very active in Yemen. Similarly, I would say in Libya, they kind of leave it, on the one hand, to the Europeans who are close. They urge the Egyptians, the Emiratis, to find a way forward. American relations with Turkey obviously are not very cooperative right now, so they do not have much leverage there. I'll end the sort of policy overview with Afghanistan, where again, I'm sure you're following the developments that both Presidents Obama and Trump wanted to leave. They have not been able to. President Trump had this negotiation with the Taliban, with Zalmay Khalilzad. The jury is out whether that's at all holding or working. But they have reduced their presence a lot in Afghanistan. It is possible that the U.S. will continue to reduce its presence during this year, but there could be a lot of surprises and developments in Afghanistan. We will see, but the trajectory is to gradually reduce, if not completely leave. That's kind of where we stand. Now, quickly on COVID and the elections, and then to conclude. Obviously, the COVID crisis is both obviously a health crisis and the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. And it is still, we're still either in the middle of it or in the early stages of it. The US today is experiencing a major resurgence of the virus, and that might have major second round impacts on the economy. What this means politically is a number of things that the US public, whoever's in the White House in January 2021, the US public is consumed with its own problems, with its domestic concerns, will have very little interest or time for any major foreign policy ideas or adventures. The Congress will have its hands full financing social welfare and health protection, as well as financing a recovery when that's possible. So there will be very little money to spend on foreign policy extras. So I think the US will be certainly entering a much more domestically focused phase, no matter who's president. And the means at its disposal economically will be much different. On the elections themselves, today, it looks like Trump's chances of re-election are difficult. Obviously, there's still a few months to go, but that perception is growing even among Republican leaders, maybe for obvious reasons. The country is in the worst shape it's been in for decades. People are scared, people are poor, unemployment is high, and his role has not been very much of a leadership role, either in fighting the pandemic or in reacting to these massive protests which have erupted over racial history and racial tensions in the US. Rather, he has encouraged and stoked these racial tensions, and that has not gained him many points among middle-of-the-road voters. So right now, it looks like it's difficult for him to win. It looks like Joe Biden has a very good chance of winning the presidency. Of course, we cannot predict, and things could happen between now and November. It's also uncertain what the conditions on November 3 will be, and what will the pandemic look like. Will people actually go to vote? How many people will go to vote? And how will that affect the results, depending on who actually dares to go to the polling station if things are difficult. It's possible, therefore, that, as I said, the Democrats could win the White House. It's also possible that they could win the Senate. That would mean, if that happened, the Democrats would control both branches of government, the White House, the Senate, and the House, which is the lower house of Congress. That was the case in Obama's first 2 years, so it's certainly not unprecedented. It's happened several times in the past, but it really would give the Democrats a lot of dominance to put their agenda forward. 90% of that agenda will be domestic, relating to all of the domestic issues that are there. Let's conclude with what might a second-term Trump presidency mean for the Middle East? What might a first-term Biden presidency mean for the Middle East? The Trump presidency, obviously you could say more of the same. You know, he's been president for 4 years. I think he will be more himself in the second term because he will feel, firstly, that he doesn't need to be reelected, so he can just be himself. Secondly, he will feel that he was vindicated and that he was right and that he was reelected and that all of his advisors were wrong and that he should increasingly trust his own instincts. In the Middle East, I don't think this will mean anything dramatically new. It will mean continued pressure to get out of Iraq and Syria and in Afghanistan, and I think in a second term he will get out. It will also mean, I think in terms of Iran, it might be more interesting because I think the Iranians, if Trump wins a second term, might figure we're going to have to talk to this guy. We can't take 4 more years of this. And Trump wants to talk to the Iranians, so I would expect an attempt at negotiation between the Iranians and the Americans with limited results, maybe over the nuclear deal, some missile restrictions, but not a lot, and some proxy war, terrorist restrictions, but really limited to the US, not any major withdrawal of Iran from anywhere in the Middle East. So I would think limited. The course in Israel will continue, an annexation, whether you call it ending up in an apartheid state or whatever you want to describe it. And in other arenas, I don't think the US will do anything new with the Gulf and so on. Of course, the Middle East itself can produce surprises, but I don't think we'll see surprises from Trump. If we conclude with some, guesses about Biden presidency or reflections, one we can say it's also partly a known quantity. Obviously, Biden was for 8 years Obama's vice president and very involved in foreign policy, so he's not a new leader, he's not a new president in foreign policy, and all of his foreign policy team is well known. They were people who served with Obama. They were the team that was going to serve with Hillary Clinton if she were going to be president. They are very well-known people with very well-known perspectives. On Iran, they will go back probably into the JCPOA, but they will attempt then to build new negotiations with Iran and try to include issues of missiles and Iran's presence in the Middle East on the negotiating table. I think those negotiations would be useful, would be help de-escalate the situation, but I don't see the potential of any major breakthrough other than, reinforcing the nuclear deal and maybe some limited limits on missiles. But I think the Biden administration will resume outreach to Iran. They will try to include the Gulf countries in these negotiations in some way. They feel that maybe they should have done that the first time. But at the same time, the Biden team has a much less positive view of Saudi Arabia, particularly with the Crown Prince and the human rights violations. They have, like Obama, a more negative view of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince, and that might really affect relations. On Israel-Palestine, I think it will be too late for them. They will certainly change the rhetoric. They might try to maneuver in terms of positioning and rhetoric, but I think by the time the elections happen, Israel would have already annexed much of the West Bank or its settlements there, and there will be really no room to negotiate. And certainly there's no appetite in the US to pressure Israel in any major way to reverse any of that. So I don't see any daylight there. On Yemen and Libya, I do think a Biden administration will be more active diplomatically like John Kerry was. He was very active on Yemen. I would expect more diplomacy there, more diplomacy to try to resolve Libya. But I don't see a possibility of diplomacy being actually fruitful in the Syrian case. And I don't know anybody in the US who believes that there is, unfortunately, a diplomatic way forward in Syria, but maybe they could be surprised. On Afghanistan, I think Biden will have the same conundrum or challenge that Obama had, that Trump had, that obviously the US wants to leave, and obviously it's very difficult to leave. And I'm not sure Biden will find any magic wand to get out of there. So let me stop there, with all of those remarks, and I really look forward to your remarks, comments, and questions if you have them.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. It was a first-class analysis, and I'm sure there will be questions and comments because the theme itself is of great interest nowadays, with all uncertainty which we have in the Middle East. We still have more uncertainty with the results, which we don't know, of the American elections. And we do understand that any president will have a great impact on the situation. So please, are there any questions or comments or whatever? Please, the floor is open for everyone.
Irina, if I may.
Sure.
Well, Paul, when you were talking, thank you for a brilliant presentation, but when you were talking about America's interests, you mentioned containment of Iran. Still, well, from my point of view, this obsession with Iran is not clear because, as you say, even you confirmed it, that Iran actually is not a vital threat to the US. And from my point of view, it is no threat at all for the US. Though, of course, it is a headache for US regional allies. But still, what do you think? Why there is such an obsession? Because from my point of view, it's really some kind of an obsession. I felt that in Israel, but in Israel, it can be understood. But what about the US? Why are the people are so, so willing to contain Iran? It's not the USSR, it's not even North Korea. It's a very, I think, from my point of view, it's a very negotiable country. You can always make a deal with them. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I agree that it is kind of an obsession and it's overblown. I'll say two things: why it is an obsession, and my assessment of what the actual threat, relating to the U.S. is. On the obsession side, the biggest event in U.S. modern foreign policy history before 9/11 was the hostage crisis of '79. And that, for a generation of Americans, was the biggest event of their generation. There was World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, Iran, 9/11, and now COVID. Those are like the big things that shaped people's perceptions, a generation of perceptions. So that hostage crisis was a core part of it. It pivoted the U.S. public opinion as well as U.S. national security for 20 years to be focused on Iran, right? And that obsession is inherited. Secondly, it linked, at least for 20 years, the fear of Islamic radicalization and Islamic terrorism to Iran and to Shiite Islam in the American imagination. 9/11 now has taken it in a different direction. That obsession now is mixed up. But there is an obsession going back to 1979. The second variable, which is enormous, that Israel and Israel's Israel influence in the United States, Israel's dominance in Washington, in Congress, in both political parties, in the media, keeps Iran an American obsession because it's an Israeli obsession. So Israel exports and preserves its concern. And for Israel, they do see it as an existential concern. You know, if they get nuclear weapons, they, you know, rightly or wrongly, they do see it that way. And that obsession of Israel is effectively exported and imposed in the United States. Unfortunately, whatever you want to describe it. Now, when you look at, so that means that in American public opinion, in American media, both Democrat and Republican, no, everything's fine. So, looking at U.S. actual, you know, national security concerns about Iran, they exist. As I agree with you, Nikolai, they're not existential, they're not huge, but to be realistic. There is a continuing concern in the Persian Gulf that because the U.S. considers the Persian Gulf a global national security interest for them, they continue to be there mainly to make sure that Iran cannot disrupt trade or energy flows through the Gulf. Now, interestingly, and this was the Carter Doctrine, as you know, interestingly, Trump, when Gulf shipping was attacked, did not react. So there is a question mark about how much will the U.S. defend Gulf shipping, but I think in general, it is remaining there. And Iran is a threat to that in American viewpoint. Secondly, in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, the U.S. is concerned about Iran's presence in Yemen. Not because of the Yemeni civil war, which is another headache, but they are concerned that Iran might gain a foothold in Bab el-Mandeb and be able to have the capacity to block the Red Sea. They do monitor the risk of Iranian mining activities there, so it is a concern. Thirdly, the U.S. national security community is very concerned about Iran's what they consider global capacity, criminal/terrorist network, its ability, if it wanted to attack something in Washington, D.C. or New York or Chicago or Houston. That is like a homeland security concern that when you talk to national security people, they tell you, you know, where they are in Latin America, which groups they're in contact with. I'm not privy to the intelligence, but it is a concern for them. So I would say Iran is a concern for the more grown-up people, but it is not a major national security threat or concern, nothing like North. So I agree with you, but there is something there. There also, you know, is a sense that it's difficult to negotiate with them as well, which is probably true. Let me stop there.
If I may, one more question about the Gulf. Recently, we heard speculations about the U.S. withdrawing its Patriot missiles from Saudi Arabia. So, have you heard about anything about it, and what is happening? Are the Americans finally abandoning their allies, or is it just a redeployment, as people among the military say? So, what is happening? Can you be?
Yeah. I talked to, you know, the U.S. military commanders, including General McKenzie, head of Central Command, and others. They said this is really not. It's you know, rearrangement, redeployment. They rushed them there more as a symbolic, you know, reassurance to Saudi Arabia and so on. That's not exactly the right equipment to have there. So no, they are not abandoning. There's no major change there. There's actually, as you know, much bigger weapons sales from the U.S. to Saudi Arabia after that incident, and continued or more intensive coordination. The U.S. military commanders say, indeed, they were surprised by the sophistication of the attack on Abqaiq. They didn't think the Iranians were that good. So they've learned from that, and they will try to defend against it the next time. What's remarkable is not the military deployment, it's President Trump's non-reaction. That's really what is more noteworthy. that Abqaiq was attacked, there was no major response. So it's at the political level, not at the military level.
Thank you very much. Are there more questions, please?
May I?
Sure.
Vladimir Bartenev, Moscow State University and Institute for Oriental Studies. Dr. Salem, thank you for your analysis of the 7 interests, or probably factors actually, that drive the US policies in the region. And I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the factor number 5 that you mentioned, great power competition. You said that it's there, but it basically tends to at least to take a back seat against other factors, and you don't see any major policy decision that was actually driven by that great power competition. So my question, there are actually 2 related to one another. One is what you consider to be a really major policy decision in the Middle East, driven by the great power competition, that you would see as a red line, you know, that something has changed and something has changed to a certain direction. And another question is basically, it relates to difference between interests and factor, because great power competition is definitely not an interest, right? It's not in the interest of the United States to have a great, larger great power competition in the region. They would probably have their predominance for as long as they could. But if we're talking about the strategy and the objectives regarding this great power competition, there might be many, right? There might be containment, there might be hedging against some risks, there might be trying to engage allies more than doing things on their own. So what actually do you see the interests of the United States vis-a-vis this great power competition right now, vis-a-vis this factor, which is definitely there, we all know? Thank you.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, my use of the word interest, and I probably should have tried to make that clear, I'm using it, I mean, it could be a negative or positive interest. In other words, obviously the interest in great power competition, you would phrase it, the interest is to push back against Chinese and Russian presence, and that's the interest. The interest in, you know, containing Iran is a negative interest in the sense they want to contain. Anyway, so the word doesn't mean that they have an interest in it, and I get that. What would be, well, when you look at the current major national security decisions made by the US in the Middle East, like the deployment in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, or their deployments in Libya before, you look at all the big moves that they've made, of course, none of them were really driven by Chinese or Russian considerations. There were other considerations. So that's fairly straightforward. When you look at the actual reality in the Middle East of America's great power competition, there are 2 different scenes. There's the competition, quote unquote, with Russia. And really there, it's hard to say that there really is much of an actual competition. The Obama administration, when Russia moved into Syria, really shrugged its shoulders, had no major reaction. You know, in a way, Obama said, "You're welcome to it, Mr. Putin, good luck." In the Trump administration, it's more complicated. President Trump effectively is a political ally of President Putin. But the deep state, if you want to call it that, is not. But President Trump is a friend of President Putin. So certainly there is no pushback, or, you know, President Trump certainly in the Middle East has no, you know, instinct to push back on Russia under President Putin in the Middle East. And indeed, he's wanted to get out of Syria rather than, you know, compete or contest Russia in Syria. Russia's limited presence in Libya has not caused any really concern for him. So with Trump, it's a very interesting sort of situation. With China, the concern is more deep and more long-term. And in the Middle East, it manifests itself in a couple of ways. Firstly, the US is very concerned about the 5G network that is spreading around the world, and that is spreading in the Middle East and potentially in the Gulf. That is already raising serious security alarm bells in the US military, and they are warning their GCC partners that they cannot use Chinese 5G because that means the military communications would have to go through 5G through China, and that means the US could no longer cooperate with Gulf militaries or other militaries. So 5G obviously is a very, very serious concern of the US, and it's something that Secretary Pompeo is raising with partners, particularly in the Gulf, but in some other places as well. In other areas, the concern, given that China is really mainly an economic player, the US doesn't seem to mind that China buys oil and gas from the Middle East. That doesn't really cause it concern, but it is concerned about China's acquiring of infrastructure or involving itself either in technological infrastructure, as I said, or physical infrastructure, like ports. The US is very concerned by the port in Israel, which has been leased to China or a Chinese company. And it is worried that as China builds its one road, one belt, these ports and railroads will become the bones of the future Chinese empire. So there is a concern about it, but it is the case that the US hasn't made any major move about these things, but it has talked to Israel, it's talked to Saudi, UAE, Qatar about all of these issues, and it's watching it very closely. But militarily, to be clear, the US perception of military threat from China is on the geography of it really limited to the China Sea and the Pacific. It doesn't exist currently in the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Sea or the Middle East as a direct military security threat. And the other threat, which is more severe, is China's capacities in cyber hacking and cyber warfare, and that the US is completely militarily vulnerable to Chinese cyber hacking and to Chinese artificial intelligence advances. And secondly, the US is very concerned that China is ahead of the US in space warfare and in the ability to take out US military satellites, which is why the US launched its Space Force and is really concerned about all of those things. Those are not Middle East specific, but they are real.
Thank you. I know that Pavel Timofeyev wanted to ask a question. Please do it. Pavel, are you here? Sorry. What about other questions, please? Well, while there is a pause, I would like.
No, there is. I can see hands up.
Good.
I can't read the Russian names, but.
Go on, please.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. It was just a pleasure to listen to you. I have very short questions. Do any developments, or maybe will any developments in the Middle East region provide any opportunities for Russian-American rapprochement?
Okay. Well, yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, first of all, the Middle East, like the rest of the world, is going through its biggest economic crisis in living history. Economies are going to contract by 7%, 8%, 12%, different contractions. The economic disaster is affecting oil producers, previously rich, as well as affecting oil consumers. So everybody is affected. The Middle East, like the rest of the world, maybe is still in the first phase. There probably might be second phases of the pandemic coming. So the Middle East was already in very bad shape before the pandemic and before the economic depression, is definitely going to be in much worse shape in the coming months and years. So the Middle East is going to, as you say, provide quote unquote opportunities or problems, issues. Obviously, there's ongoing problems and issues in Yemen and Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. Lebanon is on the brink, possibly, of complete collapse. Algeria is not in a very good situation. Morocco is having a very difficult time in the second wave of pandemic and economics. Jordan is managing, but has issues. Iraq is in a very difficult condition. So the Middle East will provide opportunities, quote unquote. And I think what's very important for policy thinkers, particularly looking at the American-Russian relationship, whether it's a Trump presidency, and President Trump has an excellent relation with President Putin and would love to cooperate on issues, or whether it's a Biden presidency, who for other reasons would also like to cooperate with President Putin. That Biden and his team believe that what needs to be restored in US foreign policy is two things. One, rebuilding America's traditional allies and alliances. Okay, NATO, Japan, Asia, so on. And okay, I get that might be perceived as conflictual with Russia, but the Biden team also believes that dealing with competitors, which is really how they view them, at most adversaries, but certainly not enemies, the way to deal with competitors is mainly through diplomacy, looking for areas where the US and Russia can cooperate, and in areas where they cannot cooperate, at least to limit the damage. I do think there is an opportunity, and here it's not for me to suggest to Russian, experts and so on, but when I try to understand the Russian trajectory and, try to understand President Putin's perspective, I understand the perspective that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and the West, even while talking very nice, extended NATO to, to Russia's borders, and that caused a lot of concern. The Americans under Bush, the father, promised they would not do that. Clinton went ahead and did that. So I get all of that, and I get that President Putin felt that he had to push back and correct and undo some of that. But I would say we should be in a post-reactionary situation. That okay, mistakes were made and so on. I think the state being in, that I think the US and Russia have enormous common interests all over the world and have enormous interests in negotiating and cooperating with each other while continuing to compete in many areas. That's fine. And in particular, when you look at the state of the world, it's a world that is plunging into depression, economic depression, with an unknown number of crises that are going to erupt in the coming months and years, it is dangerous for the world, it's dangerous for Russia, it's dangerous for anybody to bank on a disordered world, the absence of any global order. I don't think that should be the way forward. So I would say on the US side, both Trump and Biden would want to cooperate with Russia. I might say that, that is something that maybe, leaders in Russia should consider. Is it a good thing to reach out and to cooperate? And obviously cooperating on Syria, on Yemen, on Libya, on dealing with the pandemic and the depression, marshalling, also getting China in line, reviving the Security Council. There's so many things that are of great value for the world, and I would say for Russia. And this time Russia, rather than feeling ignored as it was in the 90s, can be one of the leaders of this revival of the new global order.
Thank you. This is very optimistic response to the question. Well, any more questions?
Can I?
Sure. Welcome, Boris.
Thank you. Boris Dolgov, Dr. Boris Dolgov from the Institute of Oriental Studies. Thank you for your speech, Dr. Paul. I have two questions. The first one about the crisis in Libya, and so namely about the division inside of NATO in this crisis. We know that Turkey and France now have some conflict in this crisis in Libya. What do you think about the politics of USA toward this situation? The situation between Turkey from one side and France and some other countries of NATO, namely Greece, about this situation? It is the first question. And the second question about the influence, maybe influence of protest demonstrations in United States. Really, it's the biggest demonstrations in the recent history of the USA. What do you think about the influence of this situation inside of USA and influence of it toward the politics, foreign politics of USA, namely politics toward situation in Middle East? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, on the Libya situation, and I'm not a Libya expert, it's obviously a very complicated situation, and I don't follow so much the internal European divisions on what's going on in Libya in great detail, and other experts at our institute do. But from my following of the issue and interactions with my own experts who deal more closely, my perception is that the contest in Libya is really dominated, it's dominated by Turkey on the one side, and UAE, Egypt, with some Russian, support on the other, while the European countries certainly have positions and so on, because they're not militarily involved at this point, they seem to have very little say in the outcome of the fighting in Libya. Obviously, in 2019, General Haftar, with backing from Egypt, UAE, and Russia, was optimistic that he might be able to settle the civil war by, the assault on Tripoli. Turkey marshaled drones and fighters and reversed that, and Haftar is in retreat. So that's in a way the stalemate that we're in. Now, interestingly, the Turkish presence in Libya and contest has a lot to do with its contest with Russia over Idlib and things that are happening in Syria, as well as contestation vis-a-vis Russia, but also vis-a-vis Greece and Cyprus and Israel and other countries over East Mediterranean offshore gas pipelines and resources. So Turkey is contesting sort of the Russian presence in Libya as pressure. and Turkey wants a geopolitical presence in Libya in order to impact any future pipeline plans, offshore gas plans in the Eastern Mediterranean. It doesn't want to be isolated. I don't see that the Europeans have any capacity to settle the issue in Libya. They have will, you know, they have political positions. Berlin tried, France has been active, the Italians have tried. When it comes to the US, currently I would say there's really no US policy towards Libya. The policy that exists is really only a counterterrorism policy that if ISIS shows up anywhere, the US will send troops and will hit them. Other than that, the US doesn't feel interested to get engaged in yet another headache. They don't have the capacity to do that. I think a Biden administration would try to be more diplomatically active because they count on diplomacy much more. On the protests in the US, they are massively significant. As you said, biggest protests in decades. They're the biggest revival of the racial question in the US since the 1960s, which is, you know, almost 50 years, or it is 50 years, so it's a half a century. It is a very, very major thing, but it doesn't have to do, obviously, with foreign policy. It's not about foreign policy, and it is not, you know, it's not, one cannot trace any direct line between the protests and their outcome and any particular foreign policy outcome, other than to say, like I said about the health crisis and the economic crisis, that we also have a racial and political crisis, that America in 2021 will be 95% concerned about domestic issues. It'll be more isolated, less concerned. It doesn't mean it won't have a foreign policy and a massive military and a global strategic agenda, but the politicians are going to have a hard time convincing the public to spend, you know, continue to spend and all of that. Other than that, it's hard to say that there's any particular link.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, any more questions? If not, may I take an advantage of
I see two hands, Mr. Vladimir and Mr. Alex.
I don't see on my screen, so if you see, just ask
I
them.
see them from America. Maybe it's my advanced intelligence capacity.
From here. So if there are questions, please proceed. I simply cannot see a face.
I don't know. I'll say Mr. Vladimir, yes.
He was going to ask, I think, something, right?
Okay.
Well, go ahead. Since you're on the line, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to maybe it's speculations, but you also had a speculative part in your talk when you were thinking what will become to the U.S. policies under Trump or under Biden if one is re-elected and the other is elected. So just imagine, again, coming back to Trump's potential re-election, whatever the chances are. So he followed his promises in many directions beyond the Middle East, right? He was suggesting many things in trade policies and almost everything he did. And he proposed this as his major accomplishments to the audience. During his first term, he had some promises regarding the Middle East, right? And pulling back from the Middle East was one of them, and from Iraq and from the wars in the Middle East. But this is a complete failure for him, because now it's already several months before another election, and the troops are still there, and nothing happened, right? So imagine if he is reelected. There are for him probably two options. One is forget about the Middle East, not to draw attention to the region where he didn't have any accomplishments whatsoever. And if he does not draw attention, he can leave everything as it is. Just not talking about the troops, leaving the troops there in any country than they are right now, not doing anything special, neither on Iran, and doing more on China, which is more domestically, you know, consumable. Mm-hmm. And the other option is actually trying to do more on the Middle East, because China is difficult, and everything around China and the South China Sea in general is much more difficult probably for the United States right now than the Middle East still. So try to make some accomplishments there. And another strategy will be draw the troops back home, etc., etc. Be more active. What do you think is more realistic? As
I mean, in a way, those are three scenarios. I think the scenario of doing more and thinking that he could accomplish anything in the Middle East, either, you know, for either party, is really out of the question. I don't think that's in anybody's consideration. Other than what I did mention, he will attempt to negotiate with Iran and get some, you know, some Trump deal to replace the Obama deal. Otherwise, no, there is no ambition to have any new ambitions in the Middle East. That leaves the two other scenarios: either completely leave, which is what he wanted to do, which is what Obama wanted to do. He will continue to look for ways to do that. I do think that the US will leave Syria in a second term, either probably Trump or Biden. Staying 4 more years, I don't think is in anybody's plans. Afghanistan is a more difficult guess, although Trump might continue to try to do it even before the election. My guess is the comfort zone for the US would be simply to have less troops there, to have them well protected, and to be there for the long term. And as long as troops are not being killed and they're not in the headlines, it's not a very difficult thing to keep. So I think it's between scenario 1 and scenario 2. Scenario 2 being keep a small presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, maybe Syria, keep it out of the headlines. In Iraq and Syria, I think Iran would be okay with that. I mean, I think Iran is happy to partly coexist with the US. So, you know, they might not escalate against the US. I can see that happening. Afghanistan is a different thing. So that's where I see the realistic options. I do have to go, Irina, soon, so maybe a last question.
So, okay, is there any question left? Not as.
Mr. Alex has a question and Miss Irina has a question. Maybe take both. Yes, please.
Okay, just one question and we will let Paul go. I'm sure this will not be the last meeting of ours. So, okay, last question, please.
Irina.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And I have a short question about Turkish-American relations. Some 10 years ago, the two countries supposed their relations to be the model partnership for other Middle Eastern countries. And nowadays, we see that there are more and more problems and diversion issues between two countries just in the Middle East. And do you suppose that the presidential election will make any change in Turkish-American relations? And do you think that the two countries will ever return to that idea of model partnership in the Middle East?
Thank you. And maybe we'll take a question from Alex and I'll try to answer both because his hand has been up for a while. Mr. Alex?
Thank you. Thank you for everything, but I would like to ask you a very strange question. What's your sense whether Mr. Netanyahu is going to implement his promise to annex or to spread his sovereignty over the Jordan Valley in the current circumstances there? Where from is my question. We have just had a video online conference with some prominent people within the Israeli elite, And it was quite obvious that the century deal put on by Mr. Trump provoked a great rift and divide within the political elite in Israel. So for the time being, I have an impression that it is absolutely unclear whether Mr. Netanyahu is going to implement it, his promise, or it was only election game, election play. And what could be the Trump's reaction if Netanyahu makes this step to implement his promise and to annex the Jordan Valley in the light of the internal American situation? I think that Mr. Trump could accept it, despite the fact that the step would be one-sided. But Netanyahu is referring to the century deal.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. First on Turkey, yeah, it's a very complex situation we're in now from where we were even 10 years ago when President Obama did his famous speech in Turkey and even held it up as a model. A number of things I think to take into consideration. Obviously, Turkey's membership in NATO was built around the dynamics of the Cold War, the contest with the Soviet Union. That logic no longer exists. What was beginning to replace it after the end of the Cold War was Turkey's movement westward towards the European Union with membership talks, certainly with the initial rise of the AKP and Erdogan modeling a democratic evolution, a moderation of a sort of a conservative Islamist party into a democratic institution that could be compared to Christian Democrats in Germany, or so. At least some people made that comparison. A Turkey that was integrating into the global economy and growing in a free market economy, becoming really a major member of the world economy. So after the end of the Cold War, it was seen that Turkey was, you might say, westernizing or integrating into the Western relationship, and that gave also the logic reinforced that, okay, it's also a member of NATO, a Western alliance. The US has a lot of interest there. The parting of ways has been at several levels. Obviously, Syria itself has been the biggest problem. Simply put, the Americans backed the Kurds. Turkey considers the Kurdish groups terrorists. You know, that's really been the major divide. And remains the major divide. I meet with President Erdogan when he comes every year. Everything in his mind is about the Kurds and about US support for the Kurds. Every question you ask him, the answer is the Kurds. The second parting of ways is that Turkey has moved away from its democratic path towards an authoritarian path, which is sort of viewed negatively in maybe not by President Trump, but by others in the West. Thirdly, it has moved away from a democratic pluralist Islam to clearly backing political Islamist parties, even suspicion of backing groups like ISIS and so on, really not what was expected of the AKP and President Erdogan in this world of democratizing, moderating Islam. That was a big problem. And the straw that kind of broke the camel's back is the S-400 deal with Russia and the whole new Turkish-Russian relationship, which the US military establishment, the NATO military establishment, views as very, very difficult and very problematic. You add to that a personal aspect that a number of US courts are trying Turkish businessmen who have direct links to Erdogan and his family And Erdogan is furiously upset about that, and that has muddied the relationships with the US. So I think whereas the relationship continues and will not break, the US doesn't want to break with Turkey, Turkey doesn't want to break with the US, it will remain a very complex and conflictual or conflicted relationship, and neither a second-term Trump nor a first-term Biden can fix it, but they can try to manage it and limit, the damage and so on. On Israel, Palestine, obviously, Israeli politics is hugely unpredictable and very complex. But I think the big picture is Netanyahu and the right wing in Israel will not miss this historic opportunity that they have between now and November. This likely is not going to come again. Public opinion in the Democratic Party has shifted way in a different direction against the Israeli right wing. Speaking of the African-American Black Lives Matter, they are very much in a pro-Palestinian mood. So the Democratic Party, and including a lot of young Jewish Americans, are not at all in this mindset. So this might be Israel's last chance for this grand theft or grand take. I think what Netanyahu is facing is the reality that as he proceeds to annex, there's a lot of problems. He has a huge problem with Jordan and King Abdullah of Jordan, and worries about what might happen in Jordan. He is concerned that the Gulf countries have made it clear that their rapprochement with Israel will not continue if he does it. He has some concerns about Egypt, and will it be able to manage if there's some big backlash there. So I think the bottom line is he's going to go ahead with it, but he's trying to figure out how to do it and try to limit the risk and limit the damage. I think what in effect that would mean is rather than annexing everything, he can annex big chunks, some things, and present it as, well, I didn't annex everything. We can talk about this, we can talk about that. The reality is the Gulf countries and the Jordanian government will not, they don't have many tools. What are they going to do? Launch a war? What are they going to, there's not much they can do. And Netanyahu wants to annex particularly the settlements, and he has to at this point politically. So I think the annexation will go ahead. It will be a matter of how much, maybe not the Jordan value, but I think certainly most of the settlements, I think, are going to go ahead. But this is the Middle East, and everybody can be proven wrong within a day. I thank you all for being in this meeting today. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I'm glad the technology worked. And I hope to see you in Moscow soon, or in Berlin, or in Washington, or something like that. And Irina, thank you so much. Nikolai,
thank you, Paul. Thank you. On behalf of all participants, let me thank you so much. And we are looking forward to our next meetings. All the best.
Have a good evening.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye.